Today's episode is sponsored by Vitality Health RX Supplements. Whether you're an athlete, a busy professional, or just someone looking to prioritize health, Vitality Health RX has what you need. With premium ingredients and rigorous quality control, their supplements support your body's natural functions. Visit shopvrx.com and use code FEELGREAT15 for 15% off your first order. Thanks to Vitality Health RX for sponsoring this episode. Now let's dive in.
Welcome to the Feel Better, Feel Great podcast, episode 128. I am Dr. Andrea McSwain, and today we're talking about medicine for the thyroid. This is a series on improving organ performance. As we dive into the podcast, I want to remind you that while I am a medical professional, the information shared here is intended for education purposes only. It is not a substitute for personalized medical advice. Always consult with your physician or healthcare provider for guidance on your specific healthcare needs. So let's embark on this health education journey together. Here we go. The thyroid. I love talking about the thyroid. I think it's really, there's some complexity, but once you figure out what's going on, you can really help yourself get better overall. So the thyroid is a gland. It has a lot of cellular turnover. It has a very high nutrition demand. It is located in the front of the neck in this kind of bow tie formation right over the trachea. So it has some special innervation. It has some special blood supply. And its role is a gland that really helps mediate all the functions of the body. So it's very important as a regulatory organ. And we want to make sure that we understand what it does so we can understand symptoms related to it, and then also how to help you feel better overall. So feel better, feel great. So it regulates metabolism. So that's why sometimes when people feel sluggish or their bowel doesn't work that great, or they're losing hair, or they're noticing some puffiness anywhere and everywhere. The thyroid is involved in thermoregulation. So how we regulate our body temperature. If you're one of those people that's always cold, you really want to listen to this podcast. And then also energy levels. On the one side, and the more common symptom for thyroid dysfunction is a sluggishness. So kind of that Eeyore effect. But on the other hand, thyroid, when it's overactive, can cause tremendous anxiety, palpitations as the heart is racing, weight loss. And so these are important ways to understand what the thyroid does, and then symptoms of it being slow or it being fast, and then us trying to find that perfect little sweet spot for you. Important thyroid conditions include hypothyroid. So hypo means low, and thyroid, so low thyroid. And then hyperthyroid is high, hyper's high, hyperthyroid. Then you get some other things that are up for discussion, and these are autoimmune. So basically, as the thyroid is a glandular tissue, has some vulnerability to destruction, actually. And we see with Hashimoto's thyroiditis that this is a common condition, but basically the thyroid gets inflamed, so it overperforms, and then it gets burnt out, and then it underperforms. And that is when it gets sluggish, and it usually stays exhausted. And so that is Hashimoto's thyroids. And then Graves' disease is the thyroid starts to go into hyperdrive, and it exhausts the body. And so in that exhausted state, there's a tremendous amount of weight loss, palpitations, anxiety. There's actually some ocular manifestations, like the eyes kind of bulge forward. Those are some issues there. So throughout this podcast, I want to give you as many case studies as I can. A lot of times people have come to me and said, my doctor just won't test my thyroid. There are a lot of Facebook groups. There's a lot of general information about the thyroid, often because you have to kind of understand something that's very important in how thyroid dysfunction is diagnosed. And once you kind of understand that key element, and I'll make it very clear for you, but once you understand that key element, you can just understand how the thyroid needs to be treated, and then you can rock and roll. So I think supporting the thyroid is amazing because it's actually something that's used with biohackers. So a biohacker is a really incredible group of people who look at how to understand biomarkers so they can actually optimize the performance of their bodies. So oftentimes people are looking at the bodies and their health through a state of dis-ease. I love talking about biohackers and thinking about biohacking because it's actually a way to optimize the health to have better performance. So you can actually use thyroid hormones and the way the thyroid impacts the mitochondria, which is the power plant of the cell, to improve and optimize your health. And the other thing is, as you're listening to this podcast, if you are more symptomatic with your thyroid and you're looking at some ways to understand the body better so you can improve, I want you to think about some actual goals here. Goals for vitality. A simple one that I think is baseline important for vital signs is temperature regulation or thermoregulation. And the thyroid is very much a possibility of getting you to improve your blood and your body temperature. Okay, the other thing that I think is fantastic to understand about thyroid is I believe thyroid is a foundation for hormone replacement therapy. I am looking forward to talking about hormone replacement therapy in the future. I think just looking at hormone replacement therapy for my adult lifespan of the last 26 years has definitely shown a lot of changes. The other issue is just understanding how people can use hormone replacement therapy in that right little sweet spot. So basically, thyroid has a history as a hormone replacement therapy that is very conventionally accepted. I don't even think that they classify, or we classify it in the medical community as a hormone replacement therapy, but it very much is. Levothyroxine, which is Synthroid in its brand name, started being available on the market 45 years ago, and it has shown incredible effectiveness in helping people improve their quality of life metrics. And I think do better, feel better, look better, keep building their life into their 80s, living in their own home. So when I did my home visits, I remember this man distinctively because he completely defied his age. He was a sharp dresser. Everything in his house was clean. He had a very huge home. He lived by himself for decades, and his home was very meticulous. It was beautiful. He had plans for the day, a lot of plans for the day. He had a lot of activities going. He was vibrant. And he said, I don't know why my doctor put me on Synthroid 40 years ago. And it was the only medication he was taking. It was impressive because he was wonderful. And I really, truly believe that in this case, his thyroid hormone had made a huge impact on the quality of his life, his ability to live his life so effectively, even being in his early 80s. He was not missing a beat. And I wish that for everyone in their 80s. So first I want to talk about approaches to thyroid testing. Then I want to talk about some conventional approaches to the thyroid. Then I'll go into some holistic approaches, kind of talk about what I do in the clinic and how things work and give you some more details. There's a lot of people talking about the very, very basics of thyroid, and I will put some of that in because I want you to get those keystone points and really understand how you can evaluate your thyroid so that you can feel better, because thyroid helps everybody, right? It's just how we function better. Okay, so thyroid is often measured by symptoms. I'll say that first and foremost, but we're surprised at the number of symptoms that people have that are often ignored because they are related to thyroid, but they're just, a lot of people are passed off as like, oh, well, that's just you getting older, or maybe you shouldn't really care that much, or any number of horrible things that people are told. But if we look at blood tests, the primary test for the thyroid by convention is TSH, thyroid stimulating hormone. This is the message of your brain to your thyroid. So I say it's like the boss. Is it whispering because the thyroid is doing a great job? Is it talking in a regular voice because the thyroid's doing just fine? Or is TSH a messenger that's the brain yelling to the thyroid because the thyroid is not working well enough? And that's often making sense because TSH is yelling at a sluggish thyroid. So basically, TSH is the messenger from the brain to the thyroid saying, hey, you're doing a good job, or hey, you're doing a good job, or you're doing a really bad job, keep working. So I went to the doctor, of course. I don't know, this was some years ago. And I had my labs run, and my doctor tested my TSH, and I had requested in the appointment that I also have my free T3, free T4, and thyroid antibodies tested, to which I was told, no, okay. And second of all, I was told these are tests that are reflexive, meaning if the TSH value is abnormal, then she might consider testing my free T and my free T3, my free T4. However, the range for TSH is so broad because it's a reference range. You really can't very commonly be outside of the 2 standard deviations or 95th percentile of the standard population. So there was no way she was going to do reflexive testing because I was going to fit in no matter what. And at that time, the lab that was being used made thyroid anywhere from less than 1 to 16. So I was never going to be outside of that. Well, I wasn't outside of that, so she refused to test what I had asked. And I did not appreciate that, quite honestly. And I'm sure you don't either, because if you're listening to this thyroid podcast, you probably have listened to other thyroid podcasts, and we know we need to look at a panel. So especially understanding that the reference range includes a bunch of people who have thyroid dysfunction. When we look at an optimal TSH, we're really looking at 1 to 2. So TSH between 1 and 2, that's the happy voice. If it's a little bit less than 1, I really don't get upset about that. If it's a little bit over 2, like 2.16 or 2.3, whatever, that's fine. Then I'm always looking at free T3, and I always look at free T4, and then I always look at antibodies. So free T3, that is your checking account. That is what you can actively do. That is your active thyroid hormone. Free T4 is your savings account. So that's there that it can be converted, because it's inactive, into the active form. The body does that a lot with hormones. It does it in our pancreas with insulin, does it all over the place. We definitely need to have some certain hormones in savings accounts so that they're made and they're ready to be activated. But that takes its own mechanisms. And so when you have the checking account and the savings account, you want to realize it's the checking account that's going to be doing the work. So that free T3 is very important. In looking at antibodies, we are looking at how the antibodies are an autoimmune response that is attacking this gland. And why is it attacking the gland? We're going to get to that a little bit later. But basically, you need to understand that the antibodies really matter for the thyroid, because if the thyroid is being attacked, I'll leave that very simply, then it's not going to be working very well because it's going to be inflamed, it's going to be nutrient deprived, right? And it's going to be a little bit more full of fluid. So it's really going to be far, far less efficient than it should be. And this, again, remember, this thyroid gland is really important for a lot of our basic functioning. It's just very important. The other one you might be aware of is reverse T3. Now, I don't always test, and I don't actually often test reverse T3. Reverse T3, and understanding that the thyroid, the active thyroid of T3, right, has a receptor, and that receptor can be blocked by other things. And I'm going to go into that in a few more minutes. But I want you to understand that reverse T3 is a very important metric, but I usually reduce it down to people who have certain mediators that would make them predisposed to having an elevated reverse T3, because it's not often that I find a reverse T3. Okay, so imaging is another opportunity to evaluate the structure of the thyroid. Ultrasound is by far my preferred method of measuring this. And you can find sometimes pockets of fluid in the thyroid. People want to look for blood supply. They want to look for calcified areas. And then sometimes a biopsy is done. Now, this ultrasound-led biopsy is usually a very fine needle. It's called fine needle aspiration, FNA, and it takes a very small amount to send to the pathologist for review. And at that point, the cells can be analyzed. So if there is a nodule, it's oftentimes that a very fine needle will aspire some of the contents so that they can be evaluated. And the cells can be basically looking for cancer. When we look at conventional approaches then to addressing the thyroid, we can look at treatments for hypothyroidism and treatments for hyperthyroidism. So the main treatment for hypothyroidism is a synthetic inactive hormone called levothyroxine or Synthroid. So this is important to understand, because you might be going to talk to your doctor and say, I'm feeling sluggish, I'm feeling fatigued, my hair is falling out, I get rashes, my lower legs are swollen, they're all puffy, I can't think, I have brain fog. And the doctor says, oh, it sounds like you have a thyroid problem. Okay, astute. And then puts you on levothyroxine. Okay, but this is an easy thyroid problem that is not so easily getting solved, because you are likely getting the wrong hormone, both synthetic and inactive. I would really say taking levothyroxine is like eating a walnut that's still in the shell. Levothyroxine is like eating a walnut that is still in the shell. You have to do so much work to get that converted to the active form to actually make it worthwhile. And some people just don't have that extra ability to have that mechanism to do the conversion. So they're sitting there with a good amount of free T4 because it's inactive, and it's been supplemented or supported with prescription, but it's not helping you get better. So that is important, because then sometimes what people do is they're on kind of this take 63 days a week and 90 on the fourth day. And I do not understand that whatsoever. Basically, thyroid support is, going to be doing something to help your thyroid look better and make you feel better, have better energy. And then the other thing is going to show in your markers. So getting your labs repeated and understanding that. But a lot of times too, people get into these nuances with levothyroxine because their labs might be improving, their free T4, but they're not feeling better because they aren't converting it to the active form, which is T3. If that's the case, levothyroxine is not working for you. No adjustment of medication dosages is going to make it better. No squirrely, do it 3 days this way and 1 day this way and half the other day, which I've seen some really almost intense algorithmic equations to get these thyroid dosages. And I'm like, whoa. How are you feeling? Not any different. That's because you're on the inactive form. So anyway, looking at that, so basically your T4 is very inactive. So coming into treatment for hyperthyroidism, basically at this point, the thyroid is being inundated. It's been hyperreactive mode. Everything is up-leveled in the thyroid. The TSH is whispering because it doesn't want the thyroid to do any more work. And a lot of times medications are used to actually create destruction in some of the tissue of the thyroid so that the thyroid will function less. There can be something called methimazole. There can be something called propylthiouracil or PTU. Even sometimes radioactive iodine is injected into the thyroid to destroy some of the tissues. Now, by convention also, beta blockers are given because it will slow down the heart rate. And then sometimes, even in non-cancerous situations, certain portions of the thyroid are cut out to minimize the functioning of the thyroid. So those are some conventional approaches to thyroid. When we look at a holistic approach to thyroid, I am going to say I had a beautiful patient once. She had breast cancer, but it was a very it was a very confusing breast cancer. And I won't get into the details of that, but when she started seeing me and we started looking at some labs, she tested in the thousands for her thyroid antibody. Usually thyroid antibodies are like abnormal, slightly over 15. And she was in the 3200s or something. And we know with the fantastic book written by Dr. Brownstein of Why We Need Iodine, that her thyroid had very much been involved in her breast cancer. So thank you, Dr. Brownstein. He says there's definitely a link between iodine, breast cancer, and hypothyroidism. And I have to say, this is a remarkable appreciation for nutrients, glandular tissue, hormone function, and also the fact that we are one unit. So first of all, when we look at the thyroid and you're a whole unit, we really also want to first look at your history. Okay, so look at your mediators. What are some things that caused like a threat to the thyroid? Do you hang out a lot in swimming pools? Okay, well, chloride is very similar to iodide because it's a halide. It's in the same group on the periodic table, as well as bromide or bromine, because a lot of people will, in their hot tubs, they'll have bromide or they'll have bromine pools. Well, that can be a thyroid disruptor, especially if you notice your antibodies all of a sudden shoot up. So if you have some graphene and you have some history on your labs and you look, all of a sudden your antibodies went from no problem to 300, it's likely because there's a lot of susceptibility of that thyroid, particularly if you're right at menopause or shortly thereafter. Your antibodies can shoot really high if you start doing a different activity that includes like getting in the pool at the gym. And although I think it's very important to swim and be athletic, I think you also just have to appreciate what impact that has on the body and what you need to do about it. Most likely the case is you're iodine deficient. And so your body isn't taking the chlorine and it's putting in where the iodine is, and it's very important to get that reverse T3 testing. Okay, the other thing is you might have pre-existing conditions that really matter, like diabetes type 2 can lend itself to thyroid dysfunction. You might have some gut dysfunction, like particularly bloating or gluten insensitivity, and that can be a mediator to thyroid dysfunction. Another thing is sinus congestion. So when people have persistent chronic sinus infections or a lot of oral or dental problems, their thyroid is right here. It's a high turnover gland, and it's going to have a lot of susceptibility to inflammation related to this region. And that is a very important thing to consider because you have inflammation, potential infection, and it's all very, very close to the thyroid. Diet and nutrition. How does gluten impact thyroid health? Okay, it's an autoimmune reaction trigger. It has molecular mimicry. Okay, they have a gut thyroid connection. It's also related to the inflammatory process or response. Additionally, it impacts nutrient absorption when the gut has a problem. So those mostly make sense, but molecular mimicry is an important word because basically the gluten has a very similar structure to thyroid. And so when that gluten is being processed in the gut as problematic, then the body is making some immune response information and circulating that throughout the body like a pamphlet that says, hey, there's something wrong with this thing, the way this looks. And unfortunately, your thyroid tissue looks a lot like that. And so that is molecular mimicry, and that is why we have so much of a gut thyroid connection. And when people clean up their gut, they usually feel less sluggish, their hair grows in better, they sleep better, their brain works better, they can thermoregulate. Okay, so starting at the gut is a really great idea, but recognizing you might also have to clean up what's going on in the thyroid, because if it's been deficient of nutrients and some of its hormone production has been diminished because of it, you want to clean that up. But I definitely want you to know how gluten impacts the thyroid. So, what are some important nutrients for the thyroid? Every part of the body functions a little bit different, and so it's very important to look at this gland and say, okay, what's the issue? Of course, the main one is iodine, okay, critical. However, I don't love oral iodine. I love topical iodine. I like it applied either on the breast tissue after the shower a few times a week, or if someone has very severe thyroid dysfunction, directly to the thyroid, but it can leave a brown spot. And you'll see actually your absorption rate is based on your need. So I've had some people describe it to me like they can almost hear the siphoning of the iodine in through the tissue because they're so depleted. So I really like topical iodine. Some people take it orally, and you have to go all the way through the gut to get to the iodine into the thyroid. So I feel like that's a really long journey as opposed to just putting it on the skin, having it absorb. The other thing is zinc, which I love having the zinc on the skin for the thyroid, for the skin itself. It's just a really important nutrient for immunity and the thyroid, of course, because the thyroid plays into our immunity. But then selenium can be supplemented. Selenium can also be received via Brazil nuts. So 3 soaked raw Brazil nuts every day or every few days. Put them in your fridge. They become perishable when you soak them. Don't roast them. Don't add salt after you roast them, but make sure that they're raw and soaked so they're much more bioavailable and you can release that selenium. Those Brazil nuts will do you a world of good. And then other things, definitely kelp is a big deal. Seaweed, fish, nuts, and seeds do well. But you want to also recognize that there's some foods that don't play into the thyroid very well. And those are often called goiterogenic foods. So goiter is another part of what can happen with the thyroid. It can be quite large. This is, again, so easy to treat. You just unfortunately have to find the right doctor. Definitely look at Institute for Functional Medicine as a source of excellent doctors, AAEM, ACAM, and find their physician directories because you're going to find doctors that understand how to treat goiters. And that can be if there's a lot of hormone or thyroid stimulating foods such as curly kale and possibly even soy. All right. I want to then go into discussion on prescriptions for the thyroid. So discussions on prescriptions for the thyroid. I say this is good, better, best. So good, synthetic. There's the T4 that I discussed. It's levothyroxine or Synthroid is the brand name. There's a synthetic T3 called leothyronine. Acitamil is the brand name. And that works really well because all of a sudden you have an active hormone available to you. And so you're going to get pumped up. You're going to be able to move your muscles more. You're going to move fluid more. You're going to have more energy because you have the active form. Now that's good. And I almost never prescribe T4, but T3 I like because for people who are sluggish, fatigued, T3 just gets things going. You don't have to use it forever. I want to say that about thyroid prescription. That is not true. You can use it and get to the place you want to be and then lower your dose and get off of it. So going back to good, better, best, I think really better, when this is a category they stay in the most, is animal glandular tissue. There's a lot of companies that include it in products, but Armor Thyroid actually tells you how much is in each of the T3 and the T4. So usually, of course, because it's animal glandular tissue, it's going to have the inactive and the active form. And then best, you could argue, is compound thyroid medications. And these are usually plant-based, but they're very, very specifically organized into the dosing for T3 and T4 so that you can get exactly what you need. And maybe they're also sometimes animal-based glandular tissue, but it's a very specific dosing. I prescribe this like once every few years because I think the animal glandular tissue does a lot of good for us and it's very easy. So then just thinking about you from a holistic perspective, you can think about other kind of supportive supplements to keep a Band-Aid on until you get better. So that's vitamin D, which is immune system regulation. It's vitamin B12 to give you some more energy support and support your nervous system. It's probiotics to help your gut health. And those are all really important things. And the last thing I want to talk about is just the location of the thyroid. So the neck is a rough place to be stuck in because the neck is really stuck when a lot of people have musculoskeletal issues with the cervical spine. They have sinus congestion, as I mentioned. They might have difficulty swallowing or GERD. So all these components really need an element of physical medicine, whether that's acupuncture, osteopathic manipulation, possibly reflexology. So that's a little bit about the thyroid, medicine for the thyroid, understanding different approaches, maybe what you've been heard, but maybe it is different than what you need to hear. And of course, leave comments, leave questions, whatever you have. We'll be happy to read it and review it in the comment section for this podcast. Thank you very much, and I will look forward to talking to you about the next episode, which is focusing on medicine for the kidney. Thank you.